Hi, you're listening to the We Make Media podcast. I'm your host, Karen Derricades. Today, I'm talking with Katerina Cizek, Emmy-award-winning digital documentarian. She directed the National Film Board of Canada's High Rise series on life in residential skyscrapers, which included the world's first 360 web documentary, Out My Window. I'll include the links in the show notes for all of you to enjoy this seminal work for which she received a Peabody. She is the artistic director, co-founder, and executive producer of the co-creation studio at MIT's Open Documentary Lab, where she spent the last while interviewing hundreds of media makers for Collective Wisdom, a first-of-its-kind field study of the media industry that maps works that live outside the limits of singular authorship. Collective Wisdom is a hybrid field study that sets out to map, define, and shed light on the co-creation methods within media, arts, documentary, and journalism, and adjacent areas of knowledge, design, open source tech, urban, and community planning. I've asked her to talk to me today about the Collective Wisdom study in the context of media literacy education and community arts. Hi, Katerina, how are you?
Hi, Karen. Thanks for having me today.
I'm so excited to this. This is an unbelievable undertaking and a really important project. I want to get right into it because there's just so much. I don't even know where to begin. But maybe we could start by you explaining what is co-creation, as you've come to understand it from doing this work, and what are, if you can talk about the different types of co-creation that the study identifies.
Sure. Thanks, Karen. So for us, co-creation really, at its simplest sort of unit of understanding is any kind of collective practices that live outside single authorship. So any projects that really are conceived, there's things that are collaboration. It would be impossible to make a media project today without collaboration. But the difference between collaboration and co-creation for us is that collective authorship, that the idea and the process comes from the meeting and the relationship of people rather than one person coming into a room with an idea that then other people collaborate on and contribute to, if that makes any sense. We came to sort of identifying typologies of co-creation just for the ability to speak about specific parts of it and methodologies. We talk about co-creation within communities, both in the real world, in person, but also within community online. And those two are often together, but sometimes not, and have their own specificities. And then we also, the third category is co-creation between disciplines and across organizations. So this could be within more scholarly or academic contexts where you have disciplines working with each other, or perhaps cross-sectoral in terms of organizations. So you have like a type of professional organization, such an architecture firm, working in co-creation with a filmmaker or a media maker. And then the final kind of more speculative type of co-creation that we look at in the report is this sense of co-creation with non-human systems. So humans working in perhaps, is it co-creation to work with these larger systems, whether they be planetary scale or cellular, like artists working with slime mold. And then sort of further on that spectrum is this notion of co-creators working with technological systems and ultimately artificial intelligence. And so in that section of the report, we interviewed over 30 artists, many of whom have been working with these systems for decades, and asked them about the relationship and how would they sort of place themselves on a spectrum of co-creation. And we were quite surprised with the results.
Your report begins with talking about petroglyphs. As in marking space with a kind of "we were here" as opposed to an "I was here" tag, and specifically how that represents a differing understanding of time, where the "I was here" being a singular moment in time that an individual kind of comes through a space and marks that moment, and a "we were here" as telling a much larger story of collective humanity and culture. Can you talk a bit about why that aspect of time, like a specific moment versus a multi-generational long view, is so important to the sustainability of social change that can come from co-creation?
Wow, that's a big question. Yeah, I think time, and in particular, this notion of deep time is really important for a lot of co-creators that we've spoken to around the world. And I think on the flip side of that is also this urgency of time. So when we talk about these petroglyphs, the ones in particular that kept coming to mind for me were ones that I had the honor of witnessing in Gobustan, Azerbaijan. And those are petroglyphs that really were marked and created over the course of what we believe now to be thousands of years. There's this collective imprint on the rock of humanity and of our collective story as a species. So, that intergenerational sense of, we are one, we don't stop and start with an individual life. We are part of a much larger system, whether it be, a species-centered one or a planet-centered one. And thinking about our existence in that way, I think, is really interesting and important and critical for many who are working in particular in the climate crisis, with climate crisis, and also in that that category of that typology of working with these larger systems. So what may seem like a very long time, like this time we've spent sort of closing down our lives in the pandemic, is really just a blip in time over this longer world history. But then also a lot of co-creators talk about the flip side of that, which is the ability to urgently respond to what's actually happening in the present. So there's both being informed and animated by these larger questions of world time, but also having the flexibility, the humility, and the nimbleness to address what's directly in front of us and not get bogged down by systems that might not really work for us right now. So a lot of people argue that part of the beauty of co-creation is coming up with systems that are both ancient and contemporary, and that a lot of what's happening in this century is that we're struggling with the shackles of systems from the 20th century that no longer, maybe perhaps never, served us, and we're trapped in them, whether they're sort of really, highly sort of bureaucratic, technocratic, colonial, industrial systems that sort of manage our everyday and global experiences. So, and I think also to that point of time, one quote that really stuck with me was our colleagues and friends in Detroit, in particular the Detroit Narrative Agency, that often refer to Grace Lee Boggs, who is this incredible activist, philosopher, and writer on the Detroit scene, who lived to about 101 years. And she always began every community meeting with the question, what time is it on the world clock? And that really resonates for me in terms of coming back to that question in our daily lives and rituals and in our ways of understanding what are we going to do with our day today.
Interesting. Yeah. And this, you touched a bit about the ancient traditions, and the study explains how co-creation is an ancient and under-documented dynamic. When did the emphasis on singular authorship come to dominate our thinking around creative process?
That's a big question, and I think we've certainly had a lot of interesting conversations with people that understand that field of authorship and, in particular, intellectual property. So these, I think different kinds of historians and practitioners may mark it in different ways. In particular, this French notion of the auteur and les droits d'auteur, like the rights of the author. And so there's definitely different streams of it. But for us, what felt really appropriate is something that one of the co-authors, my co-author, William Iricchio, who's a media scholar and a historian who is the principal investigator of the studio and the lab at MIT, he discovered very specifically in the literature the day in which the term producer was first used in theater. And that's, like 150 years ago. It's not that long ago. So in these sort of theater, which until that moment, you could argue, was a very collective practice. It was the troupe. It was the ensemble. It was something that many hands put together and put it on stage for many to witness and be part of. And the moment this producer emerged, the dynamics and the decision-making structures radically transformed. So you could kind of pinpoint that. You can also look at sort of in film history, how we started to formulate and industrialize the process. And then equally, you can start looking at a moment in the evolution of technologies. And of course, there's many different streams of technology that you can look at. And that's sort of what William does in his work, is trace these ongoing themes within the histories of specific technologies. But if you look at the history of digital technologies, you see very early on in the evolution of the internet and the web is this very collective, decentralized philosophy and methodology of how this technology could work in the hands of many, many folks around the world. So it's both reigniting these ancient practices and then also understanding what these new technologies, what affordances they have for us to reignite those instincts.
Yeah, well, you talk about the like equity and justice as being, a facet of co-creation, like a part of that process of what that process looks like, but also as a means that like co-creation as a means for creating more equitable and just world. How so? How what's the observation that you guys have made there?
We argue in the field report, and having spoken to over 160 people about it, that co-creation can't really exist without a framework of equity and justice. And if we can't transparently understand and critique and really understand a practice to be founded in equity and justice, it's not co-creation. So I think we do identify, and we spent quite a bit of time both in our own practices, but also speaking with others about the risks of co-creation. And we identified 6 of them. And, a big one is this co-optation, this risk of the term and the principles of co-creation being co-opted by bad actors. And we certainly see that word popping up here and there. In the Toronto context, it was used quite significantly by Google and Sidewalk Labs in a very questionable way in terms of how they were going to be consulting with the communities and with the city and even with the governments. So, people say, how can you tell if something is co-creation or not then in that framework? And there's some pretty easy ways of separating these things out. And one is, transparency and ownership and, how far do these things go? And if they sort of end at the first box that's been ticked, it's probably not co-creation. Right.
Yeah. If it ends with listening. Well, yes, we listened to you. We spent some time to bring you together and hear what you think, and then we're going to disregard it or do whatever we wish.
Yeah, and we see that process over and over again in a variety of sectors and particular colonialist practices.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's exactly when I think of just to bring it to community arts a little bit. I mean, in terms of understand what you're talking about in reference to larger like media conglomerates and the idea of like bad actors. But it's interesting in a smaller context of like museums and galleries and the way that they've internalized those colonial narratives and the way that they perpetuate them. Same with this ancient thing that you're talking about, like this idea that, like indigenous or, people don't have a word for art or whatever, right? Like this kind of old problematic narrative and this kind of newness, like there's this kind of conversation like or at least for museums and galleries are moving into this kind of delivering programming, like arts programming with, entre guillemets, like in quotation marks, with communities, but often bring those kinds of attitudes of not recognizing that people have been doing those things for a long time. And maybe they didn't have it's not that they didn't have a word for art. Maybe they didn't have a word for or a concept of this singular authorship. And that often, this idea of this practice, like this socially engaged practice or community engaged arts or these kinds of different terms that they use for it as being a new way of decentralizing power or expertise in a co-creation like workshop or dynamic as being, really problematic term, because then they often report on these activities and publish about these activities in ways that duplicate, like, again, colonial narratives and kind of charitable savior ideas of like, we've empowered this community by bringing them an arts experience. So, you can call for funding supports for co-creation and more process-driven artistic explorations, right? This is something that you identify as important, obviously, to supporting co-created works. What best practices are paramount to building those supports in ways that don't seek to co-opt the work and take ownership for these dynamic processes? Like what can these institutions or these well-intentioned individuals be considerate and thoughtful about, should they be going for such funding or receiving such funding when doing supporting co-creative processes?
Yeah, it's a huge question. And there's no one solution fits all. And I think that that's part of the frustration that sometimes people feel with co-creation, because it really, if it becomes too prescriptive or too formulaic, then it's very definition. Maybe it's less co-creative. And so it also takes time. It's messy. It's a really complicated process. And again, it's not boxes, not that you're suggesting this. I'm just reiterating, I think what you're saying is, you don't just tick a bunch of boxes and you're done. Mm-hmm. It's about really, whether it's starting a and there might be really different processes based on where you're at and who you're thinking of or who you're hoping to co-create with, as opposed to sort of an institution that's looking to open up some of their practices or their funding. And that might involve like a real sort of turning inside out of what people have done historically. So it really is more than just a consultation process and then going back to business as usual. It requires profound systemic change. And that's where people kind of stop short often. Mm-hmm. It's like, are those things really on the table? And that's certainly what we've encountered too, is just, it feels like a lot to change. That said, I think these things are happening whether individuals or institutions or even governments want to accept it or not. I think what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 months on a global scale, in terms of thinking about how are we going to survive and perhaps even thrive in the future, if we can do that, if that's still on the table, is going to require radical global scale and a rethinking of what are the distinct units of agency in the world. So, even science, you've seen incredible transformation, and it's not always completely positive either, but, there's so many consequences to these kind of radical shifts. But in science, what has happened to address COVID on a global scale and the kinds of systems that have fallen away in this quest to find treatment, to find management, and the race to find a vaccine has actually been really fascinating to see. Like suddenly, notions of ownership and intellectual property have fallen away in this, and the kinds of information that labs are sharing with each other. The kinds of Zoom calls that we're hearing scientists have with each other daily or weekly. That's unprecedented scale of co-creation in medical research anyway. Same for public programs, right? I mean, we're hearing, these things that never would have been possible 6 months ago suddenly are. So those to me are huge acts of co-creation, but they do require that, like we were talking about earlier, this notion of urgency and crisis and scale that we certainly could have foretold and perhaps we could have planned for in a different way.
Right. I mean, it's interesting, because you're talking about the beginning of how complicated and in wonderful ways like collective or co-creation can be, right? Like that, if anybody's ever worked in an actual collective organization that runs as a collective, like there's, it takes longer to get stuff done, right? Because you've decentralized the power. But when you're talking about these large institutions that have almost like overly complicated their hierarchy or the barriers that they've built in, and how quickly in an emergency, apparently some of those aren't as necessary as they might have previously spent time justifying. So again, we keep coming back to this, this long-term, short-term relationship. In the section about humans collaborating with AI, they have the very interesting question of whether co-creation requires equivalent agency, which I think is, just a great way of thinking about all forms of co-creation and something I think about on a regular basis in terms of just how what power dynamics exist when working with communities in arts workshops. But definitely it seems to me anyways that it requires some kind of informed consent and agency. And for me, like that AI is not, I see that as more of a way of like an artist or creative cloning themselves or, giving themselves extra arms, but they're the ones who are running the algorithm or telling the thing what to do. And there's none of that feedback loop that you talk about and that we talk about in participatory media in general. That's so important in the sense that you might create stuff with AI, but the AI is not giving any pushback, giving any challenge to that process. Or in the report, someone said AI creates but is not creative. Can you talk about the role that feedback loops play in participatory media creation?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that question that you've just posed. And I guess I can start at the beginning where you said there's, this notion of equal agency. Co-creation doesn't equalize agency. It doesn't expect or even, you could argue, is it even possible to have equal agency? So I think it exposes in its best form, it actually exposes and makes evident the inequalities in processes. People have different stakes in a project. They have different energy that they can contribute to a project. Some people are working double jobs and have kids. Others are, especially in this pandemic time, you really see it, the people who are living alone and trying to find things to do, as opposed to the ones that are just drowning in the overwhelming responsibilities to family, to health, to work, to community, to showing up for the movement, all those kinds of things, right? Mm-hmm. So, and struggling with the materiality of, losing work and losing homes. And so, and those are all evident in all processes. Those are all there, but they're not always evident. And so I think at its best, co-creation exposes them and demands us to acknowledge them and talk about them, not just once, but as a dynamic part of any kind of process of working together. So that's the first thing I would say in terms of agency and even ownership of a project. Some people, come in and out of a project, and that's, finding room for that and being open to that can be really challenging sometimes, but also really important. And then I would argue that with the artists that we spoke to regarding artificial intelligence, we were quite surprised at how many did say that it is a co-creative process and that the feedback loop, in particular over decades, in particular artists who have worked with this kind of technology over decades have seen an increasing amount of feedback loop possible from these systems that for them really feel like it's not just a tool. It's not just, I don't just paint, I don't just do a brushstroke knowing what that brushstroke is going to result in. There is this level of mystery and unexpectedness and a feedback where, and the unpredictability because the system keeps evolving that slides it towards co-creation. And that doesn't give agency to the machine. It's not, and it also, I think what we're trying to address or perhaps question in the report is this notion of, what is intelligence? And if we're just equating intelligence to human intelligence, we're really missing a much larger piece of the planetary puzzle, which is that there are different kinds of intelligence, and that human intelligence, as Jason Lewis, one of the scholars and artists Indigenous scholars and artists that we interview, he quotes Little Bear saying, that human intelligence is just one channel on the dial. And that's the one we're tuned into, and that there's all this other stuff going on. And what Jason and his colleagues in a really interesting article about making kin with the machines suggests that we might do better equating artificial intelligence to non-human intelligence as opposed to human intelligence. And so in that framework, co-creative relationship between humans and non-humans, being in relationship with these larger systems that we do not control, that we need to exist with, is kind of a really interesting way to think about, as you said, an art that is perhaps beyond these very limited notions of art.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say about the co-creation in terms of people giving different things to a group or to a project based on their capacity or skill or interest. I remember I was once facilitating a Facilitation 101 workshop for the Ontario Public Research Group. And someone had asked, like, what do you do when you're working with the group and people have agreed to do certain things and they haven't done them? And, how can you get people to complete their work kind of thing? And I was like, you could try meditation. Like you could, there's not really, you can't really force somebody to complete a certain piece of work, though we could shift the way that we think about group work. And again, I think about this constantly in the dynamics of schools, because we give children assignments to work in groups, and often there's this idea of this like equal pie chart, that everybody will have to do equal parts, but really it's just this like experiment in power dynamics, because of course there's power dynamics in any group, and as you were saying, maybe that co-creative process actually surfaces those, and then it becomes about that, like it becomes about navigating those things, like how do you speak up for yourself, how do you not be do all the work for a group, or take advantage of, or these kinds of things, as opposed to the actual group work. And I often wonder about how we can adapt or adopt this more like wiki idea of group work, in terms of those. Some people contribute, a lot of people on like Wikipedia, the main contributor might contribute like 90% of it, and someone else is putting in one little piece, and someone else is putting in another larger piece, and also relates to consent culture in terms of how we let people bring or give what they can. Do you see these possibilities that the internet presents us with being integrated into kind of everyday group dynamics, if we delve deeper and get to know co-creation more? Is that a goal? Is that a desire of your study and of the co-creation studio?
I think, co-creation is not going to solve everything. I think that's also, people tend to dismiss it as being like, it's too utopic and naive, and it's just not the way, the law works, for example, or so, and it's not for every process and every project. And there is a place for single authorship, particularly in the context of making sure there's verifiable facts and sourced material, there's lots of big questions around how disinformation and misinformation fueled by the particular infrastructure of the web that we know it as today, how we've gotten here, but it's really a problem. It's huge. So we're not saying, wipe out single authorship or this is the only way forward. It's really more about just nuancing and complicating and opening up our toolboxes for understanding. There are many spectra of ways to work together and contribute to the discovery process, and in particular, our quest towards co-liberation and justice and building equity.
Right. And you talk about the shifting norms around co-creation in the internet age. How does the internet complicate ideas of co-creation, and what is unique about that process online versus offline?
Well, both the collapsing of distance and time, and how both synchronous and asynchronous ways of working together become available and not available too, right? And accountability. I think that there's something about when you're in person and you're living, if you're within community and you're living together, you have different stakes that are less immediately evident online. There's an anonymity to it that can be both liberating, but also very can be weaponized.
You talked about the importance of media literacy in terms of like knowing how media are constructed as we move into a world of deep fakes and struggle with like post-truth realities. Can you tell me a bit about that? You talk a bit about media literacy and the role that it plays in the political climate online and...
Sure. A lot of the work that we're doing at Co-Creation Studio and Open Documentary Lab, we're framing as that we're living in a time of profound epistemological crisis. And crises, maybe even like it's multiple crises of knowing how do we know what we know? And what are the frameworks on which and under which and with which we mediate our realities, our social contexts, our behavior, our actions, and even our vision for what's possible. And we try to frame this within, media practices And so, there's a lot of talk around, we're deep fakes is one area that we have a lot of interest in, and we have some fellows that are creating a really interesting project in deep fakes, and we're also partnered with witness.org, which is a longtime colleagues and friends of mine around deep fakes. And so there's, how do we deal with deep fakes? And there's technology. So there's all these sort of techno-solutionist approaches. Well, let's build an app for that. Let's build apps that can detect we've seen them now online, like they show what part of an image has been photoshopped, for example, or can detect, sound that's been warped. But, as any kind of critique of techno-solutionism is that for every techno-solution we come up with, the hackers are one step ahead. There's always a way of working around that latest attempt to reveal a hack, right? So it's sort of a self-fulfilling race, sort of a tail that's spinning out. Not to say that those technologies aren't important and we have to pursue some of that, but that's not going to solve everything. And then you've got the
Sorry, can you break that down just a little bit? So it's a type of app where you would have to, let's say you run across some content online and you wanted to know if it was fake, you would have to upload it to the app kind of thing, or?
Yeah, so a lot of the platforms are pursuing and doing a lot of R&D
Flagging.
In this sort of techno-solutionist approach, which is to sort of run anything that would appear on their platforms through these kinds of software systems or artificial intelligence systems that can detect technologically manipulated image or sound, right? So that's one approach to deepfake. Like, how are we going to solve deepfake? How are we going to get out of this problem, right? So that's...
And how do they, I'm just curious as a new media artist, like how do they, because a lot of images and sounds are manipulated. How do they distinguish in terms of how manipulated, or what? Do you know what I'm saying?
Exactly.
Yeah. Filter, right?
Okay. There's sort of, the jawline's been shortened, or the waist has been thinned. Okay, we can discover those things, or we can discover the kind of motion that a mouth is making, or the blinking of the eye, or the hairline. Those are places we can look to for obvious technological manipulation. But then it's like the in and the out, and the context of the in and the out of an edit, what's in the frame, what's outside of the frame. There's so many more, even just from a very technical perspective, that those things are never going to catch. And also a contextual framework, right? What's not in the image that we need to know in order to understand what this image is. Does the date on an image help us understand what's going on in the image, all the meta tagging, all that kind of stuff? How are we going to actually create techno-solutionist approaches that are going to be valuable in, putting a red X or a green check beside an image before I consume it as a user, right? That's one. Then there's a policy approach, which is regulation and sort of outlawing this stuff. And so then there's that whole sort of legal approach, which seems a little bit decentered or focusing on the wrong thing. And again, it's going to be a game of catch up, right? So there's sort of the technological approach, the legal approach, and then this third approach, and we probably need a little bit of all of it, but then this third approach is media literacy, is really making sure that we better understand how media works, and then this stops being about a deep fake, which is really just the tip of an iceberg, and under that are shallow fakes and this huge, massive world of misinformation on which the deep fakes rely, right? Deep fakes do not just function on their own; they are part of a much larger ecosystem.
And a part of that ecosystem is people not thinking critically.
That's right. So, so that's, I guess, that would be my answer to sort of why media literacy is important, in particular within the context of deep fakes, but a much broader context of fake news and even these sort of epistemological crises that we're finding ourselves in, the profound polarization of opinions and views, and understanding what we see and how we see it and what it means, and how we mirror that off the communities that we think matter to us the most.
collective wisdom asks the question, how do we share the world with each other in reference to the commons? The commons is such a massive concept. So do you want to explain it? Can you talk a bit about what are the commons and what of the process of co-creation with multiple, often anonymous authors of individuals who are sharing materials up online?
Yeah, I think we're thinking more about along the lines of the public and the commons, as in reclamation of the commons. So both in terms of resources on the planet and understanding how do we share what we've got left on the planet for the stuff that's still here. And that can be as complex as the water and the air that we breathe. And then, common space, right? Land, cities, infrastructures. I think that's the way we were thinking about it. And then, the commons in terms of the way the web understands it is problematic and really complex in the age of Facebook, Apple, Google, Netflix, Amazon. You've got these, platforms that have completely dominated and taken over the way that we're able to function online. And it's the biggest threat to democracy and to the planet, as far as I'm concerned. We were seeing places like the Philippines, where Facebook is now equated with the internet. I mean, people don't have another way of, there is nothing else on a mass scale in the Philippines. I mean, it is Facebook. That's people's access to the web. So when you're looking at that scale of domination with no regulation, that is a huge, huge bad actor and precedent, and that is our key problem. So.
Yeah, who knew that the media moguls now are like so much more monolithic and huger than we could have ever thought compared to what we're talking about with media conglomerates of before.
Yeah. So how do we deal with that problem? That is one of the biggest problems of our time, and especially leading up to these elections coming up shortly in the States.
Which again is a media literacy issue, I guess, right? In terms of like people understanding like where you are getting stuff from, or I do a lot of search and find conversations with young people in schools, and that the stock has gone up on that in the last 3 months. I'll tell you that. Before, teachers were kind of like, this is not relevant, and now everybody's like, please, But a lot of the young people, it was just interesting what they think Google is, or where that stuff comes from, or how it gets compiled, and. Yeah, they had a lot of questions of, is Google a scam? And also didn't people upload that all to Google? These kind of conflating of these platforms versus the internet versus, understanding how these things are categorized and the commercial interests, of course, behind them.
Yeah, a lot of people would argue that we need to go beyond media literacy at this point and talk about algorithmic literacy. There's a level at which it's not enough to understand things in their static form, but people need to understand what procedural logic is and how algorithms change as we put things in them, and what are the things that we put into them and how do they operate and bring things back to us. And that's really tough. That's a really, really hard, that's high level.
Yeah, because it's not as fixed as old. Yeah, we can't talk about style guides or because it's constantly the internet is a living thing.
Yeah, constantly in motion and really hidden. Like, we don't even know most of this stuff. I mean, the engineers talk about the science being black box-ish. I don't know if that's part of the marketing around it, perhaps, but there is a notion of a black box that, these algorithms are creating things that the engineers themselves can't even understand what happens. And then on top of that, you've got these murky, wild market systems that completely obfuscate the business plans and the choices that these platforms are able to make outside of public eyes and scrutiny. Right. And then you have the epistemological crisis and this fog of reality. So we can't, if you just, that's just a 3 portions of the stack of complete opaqueness of these systems that we're trying to deal with.
We've been talking a bit about, the term multidisciplinary. I don't know if, and the term anti-disciplinary. I love MIT Media Lab's use of that term. Can you talk a bit about what anti-disciplinary means?
Yeah, I mean, it's a notion at the Media Lab in their hiring practices, where the former director, Joey Ito, who left under very complex circumstances with his exposed relationship with Jeffrey Epstein in September. And certainly the Media Lab is going through a reckoning, and a much needed one, and also MIT. Just want to put that out there. That's very much part of the story. And we're not part of the Media Lab, just so you know. We're in while we have many colleagues and friends of the Media Lab, we're actually in a different part of MIT. So structurally, Media Lab is within architecture, and we're within the humanities department. So there's no funding or sort of official connections that way. There's a misunderstanding because we're called Open Documentary Lab that we're the Media Lab. So just to
and because MIT Media Lab is such a massive
and it's such a massive brand and legacy and complex history. But what we're specifically referring to when we talk about their notion of anti-disciplinary, and we find it interesting because when we started talking about co-creation across disciplines, you have interdisciplinary, you have cross-disciplinary, you have a transdisciplinary, you have all these terms that sort of come up against each other in some way. And then there's this notion of anti-disciplinary. So, and the cross-disciplinary is that people are staying in their lanes, but they're sort of driving in the same direction and working together. Anti-disciplinary suggests that there is this space that's beyond the disciplines. So it's not even in those lanes anymore. Those lines are disappearing. And specifically for the Media Lab, what they've always said is that they look for people that can't even identify with the discipline, that are going to have a really hard time, for example, being hired by a conventional engineering program or whatever, biology department, or because their work is so outside of that convention. So that's what they kind of really looked for and built up around the practices and the mythology around the Media Lab.
Right.
It's not the solution for everything either. I mean, I've heard a lot of really good arguments about not taking away all disciplines and how detrimental that can be to discovery and to
because there's a lack of framework there in terms of thinking of disciplines within their own capacity. And
sure, there's lots of great arguments against it as a one model that would fit all. And I think what we're suggesting is it's just that, particularly within university settings, but across all sectors, is like creating space for a multiplicity of practices. And multiplicity of ways of doing things. Like in some cases, a certain kind of specialization and research into that is really, really legitimate and really important.
And what's next for the Collective Wisdom Project and the Open Documentary Lab? All of MIT has been shut down, as you probably know, as all universities moved radically to a sort of distance learning, remote, virtual setting. MIT was one of the first in the States, in North America, to do so. And our lab, of course, went into that mode as well. And it's just been fascinating to see what's been rendered possible by it. And so our lab has continued to meet in a virtual setting. A lot of people went home, left Cambridge. I don't live there. I live in Toronto, so I've always been remote. So it's been fascinating to see the rest of the world sort of change to the reality that I've lived for quite some time. But it's, that said, it's been a radical shift. And now it's like figuring out what has worked. And so we'll continue online. We have public lectures on Tuesdays that are
incredibly popular, and we did them in residence and videoed them and put them online. But now doing them live, as a webinar has been really popular.
This is from the Open Doc Lab.
That's right. And Co-Creation Studio has done
every Tuesday
during the academic year. That's correct.
Right.
And so at the Co-Creation Studio specifically, we have an Indigenous digital delegation. It's a partnership with the Indigenous Screen Office here in Canada. We were set to have 13 Indigenous media scholars and artists come to be in residence with us on campus to exchange ideas and projects and knowledge within the context of Indigenous epistemologies, artificial intelligence, and digital worlds. That, we weren't able to do that in April. We did virtualize some of it then, and we're going to continue with it throughout the fall. So that's one of our big projects. As I said, we have a partnership with Witness on deepfakes. And we have a collaborative project in the works with our fellows. We have a whole bunch of stuff going on. So it's one of the good things to do is to sign up for our newsletter. That way, when there's news, you get it in your mailbox. And otherwise, we do have our websites. The Open Documentary Lab and the Co-Creation Studio has its own website as well. And more to come with the report soon.
Well, thank you so much, Katerina, for talking to me today. The work is so wonderful, and there's so many great projects. I hope everybody checks it out. There's so many wonderful co-creative projects that they highlight in the report. It's not your average report. It's stunning.
Thank you so much for all the great work you're doing with the youth and for such a deep reading of the study. We're honored. Great to hear that somebody's reading it. Yeah, and thanks for your great questions.
Thank you so much. And thanks to you for listening to this episode of We Make Media. Join me on the next episode when I speak with Project Information Literacy's Barbara Pfister about what we think we know about algorithms, the death of expertise, and which generation is struggling to navigate information systems the most. Until then, stay creative and do be artists.